There's many people as well that sometimes become skeptical when we talk about little human effort. I mean, there's a lot of talk in the space and the AI space that it's important that humans are kept in the loop. And you just mentioned there sometimes with little human effort, like allowing the AI to collect the data, that we can achieve a lot. So my question would then go to, are there any limitations of using AI to detect greenwashing? And how can we overcome these as well and ensure that there are accurate and reliable results?
Thanks for the question. It's very relevant. So human in the loop is, of course, a big topic, right? And that's always a question of how much human in the loop. So I would say that to accurately detect greenwashing, we do need human in the loop at the current state of the art in AI. So we do need it, as said, to kind of provide this kind of human judgment. So after the AI has analyzed all the data sources, has kind of merged them into specific scores and specific analysis, I would say that we still need humans to look at the facts, to look at the data behind it, and then actually to verify it. That's one thing. And that's, I think, is quite clear because any NLP system, even, the most powerful LLMs that we have now, it always will make some kind of mistakes. And I think that this is a scenario where we really don't want to admit these mistakes, because the space is already fluffy and vague enough. So there is no need for more vague stuff and proxy stuff, approximations, and so on.
Hi, everyone. It's Lauren Hawker-Zaffer. Welcome back to Redefining AI, the Tech podcast. In this episode, we're exploring a super exciting topic that has emerged from a collaborative task that is being conducted by the CEO of Equintel GmbH, Janna Lepenkova, the ETH Zurich, and the Lucerne University of Applied Sciences and Arts. All three of these industry and academia representatives are evaluating LLMs and other NLP approaches to detect and mitigate greenwashing risks based on public company data. Now, I hear you ask why. Why are they doing this and why is this of interest? Why should this be of interest to me as well? So, as social and regulatory ESG pressures increase, many companies succumb to greenwashing and an overly positive presentation of their sustainability efforts, which can be harmful, of course, to investors, the society, and ultimately the companies themselves. Now, in the aforementioned task organised with the ETH Zurich and the Lucerne University of Applied Sciences and Arts, Janna and her colleagues will evaluate LLMs and other NLP approaches to detect and mitigate greenwashing risks based on public company data. Welcome, Janna.
Hi, Lauren. Thanks a lot for the introduction.
It is lovely to have you here, and I'm really excited about the upcoming discussion. It's something that I'm personally interested in. So I think that our audience can certainly profit from the knowledge and wisdom that you're going to share with us today. Maybe to start the discussion would be good to find out, how did you become interested in NLP? Like, who or what nurtured your interest?
Yeah, thanks for the personal question. Actually, this happened when I was still at the university. So I did Chinese as my major. It was Chinese studies, and Chinese was the fifth language that I was studying. And during my university studies, I was constantly working and, of course, doing a lot with languages. So a range of different tasks like translating, teaching, compiling dictionaries, also doing some linguistic research, and so on. And that was a couple of years ago. I graduated in 2009. And at the time, the level of repetition and of routine that you had in these jobs, it was very high. And at some point, it was also a bit frustrating, because I was quite obviously more interested in more creative tasks. And I was always asking myself, okay, there must be a way to automate these jobs, so like translation jobs, all these dictionary compilations, and so on. And this is why for my master thesis, I actually already chose a topic in computational linguistics. So it was computational linguistics applied to the Chinese language, applied to some very specific linguistic phenomena in Chinese. And then I followed up with a PhD, which also was on NLP for Chinese. It was kind of a jump into cold water because I was really coming from the humanities, and then I kind of had to acquire all this math background and the programming knowledge, and of course, all the knowledge about the NLP and computational linguistics frameworks, about corpus linguistics, and so on myself autodidactically. But ultimately, I think that I really catched up well with it during the PhD years. And then I think NLP is really a very fascinating combination in that it basically encompasses both let's say the right half of the brain and then the left half. So on the one hand, you have all these linguistic, creative tasks and so on. And on the other hand, you have to have a very good logical and mathematical foundation. And I think that that's something that's incredibly stimulating.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to pick up on. So obviously you focused on computational linguistics. You mentioned about also the choice to choose NLP for Chinese. And then you discovered that you would have to transition and really apply a previous skill set that you developed around linguistics to picking up maths, like algorithmic understandings, enhance this logical skill set.
Mm-hmm.
Did you find that easy, or what would you say helped you transition to using both sides of your brain?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I would say it was still challenging, but it helped me that I was always not too bad at math, although, during high school and so on, I also was more focused on the humanities. And at that time, the type of computational linguistics that we were doing, it was still based on very deterministic frameworks. So very much rooted in logic, much more than probability, as is the case today with most of the machine learning methods. So it was actually somehow also easier to understand how you can model the structure of language using these logical frameworks. Whereas today, I often see that, for instance, NLP engineers or machine learning engineers, they have a very strong mathematical background, but they don't really grasp, all these nuances of language. So you even see it now oftentimes, when we talk about prompt engineering, there is often this issue that people try to talk to LLMs as they would talk to another human, with all the, under specifications, ambiguities, and so on, without actually realizing that LLMs need a very systematic and very clear instruction to perform well. So that's, I think it's really the combination of both sides and the balance between both sides that's very important. If you only focus on one side, that it's very difficult to get the whole picture.
Would you say then there's almost a limitation to what you can get out in the interaction with an LLM then if you approach it from more of sort of humane, natural interaction, discourse interaction perspective? Like, do you think that people need to understand how to change their approach, that they should develop more of a systematic approach themselves? Mm-hmm. Do you think that that is a hurdle at the moment or something that will be naturally overcome?
It depends on the task. So if you just want to do some casual conversation, maybe even some content generation with the LLM, then, this very natural and intuitive way of interacting with it, I think it is enough. But if you want to work with all of these more complex frameworks, like, for instance, now we have LLM-based agents and so on, which really need very clear reasoning chains so they can achieve specific goals and so on, and all of this is multi-step, then I think that it really needs very clear definitions. And the funny thing is that people always think, okay, cool, I don't need to code anymore. And now I can just, write in language what I need to have. But then, they really easily are tricked into this deception that, okay, they can just talk to the LLM as a human.
Do you think that one day it will be possible to talk to it just like a human?
I think that would be at the level of AGI, probably.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think there are many things lacking now. Also, like more symbolic world knowledge. So really, a representation of the underlying world. I think it will be possible, right? Because we also, as humans, we have a lot of performance failures when we use language, when we kind of listen to our interlocutors and so on. So we always have some level of error and mistake going on there also. So why not achieve the same level with an LLM?
Mm-hmm. So let's find a little bit. Let's find out a little bit more about yourself. Where are you on your own journey? Then, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? We know some about who you are,
yeah,
but you're also a CEO. You're heavily involved in actioning various things in different directions. So let's hear a little bit about what you're doing there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so as said, basically after my PhD in computational linguistics, I started working so I worked for a couple of years in research and then went into multiple industry projects. So that was with bigger tech companies. I did projects with Abby, I did projects with Google, and then also several other companies. But my goal was always to have my own companies, because it's like when you're full of ideas, then it's always very difficult to kind of mold them into the specifics of an existing company. So at some point I just felt that, okay, now I have enough industry experience, I have enough technology background, and I started the first startup. It's called Anacode, with a co-founder of mine who was more on the commercial side. And with Anacode, we are focusing on innovation intelligence and innovation research. So for instance, one of the topics that we are studying intensively now, it is actually artificial intelligence. And then all the possible verticals across different industries, because we have many companies from the more traditional industries like real estate, energy, automotive, and so on, coming to us and then basically saying, okay, all these disruptions with AI, with digitalization, automation, and so on, they're going on, but we don't really know what to do about it, where to start, how to implement it, and so on. And for them, basically, we then provide a very custom intelligence that extracts insights from the research and all the publications on these topics, and then also puts them into the context of their specific business case and their specific operations.
Excellent. Yeah. So let's move on then to your efforts with the evaluation that you're carrying out. So I just want to address the obvious. Many companies, they're responding at the moment to the climate crisis with green marketing. Now, while their core business does remain, as we know, fossil fuels, why is this, Janna, in your opinion, and how can individuals navigate the quite complex landscape of sustainability claims? And also avoid being misled by companies, because I think a lot of people are certainly misled by the claims that are being made around sustainability that obviously these companies that engage in greenwashing. Maybe we can start by explaining the following very briefly. What exactly is greenwashing?
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, let's start with the basics. Greenwashing, actually, it's definitely not a scientific term, and it's even not so much used in the regulatory or corporate context. So that's why a very strict definition is difficult. But in general, greenwashing is when companies focus a lot of their effort and a lot of their spend on providing kind of a sustainable image of themselves. So they spend this effort at the communication level rather than at the level of execution, where they can actually undertake measures, implement policies, and so on to become actually sustainable. Maybe one example, it's actually a rather old example from the 80s. And I think it was the first time that the term greenwashing was coined. That was the Save the Towel movement in hotels, right? So even today, when you go into a hotel, then often you have this note, please reuse your towel to help us save water and so on. But then there were some investigations and people really digged into it. And what they found is that, okay, of course, saving the towels, it helps the hotel save water, save laundry costs. But actually, in other areas, the hotel was not sustainable at all. Yeah. So that really shows that, okay, it's easy to be sustainable if it can help you to save cost, but it's much harder if you actually have to invest. And this is something that often has to happen, especially in the environment dimension. There are some industries that are much more prone to greenwashing than others. Yeah. So basically the two classical groups are those industries that are kind of a bit dirty by themselves. So for instance, oil and gas, to some point also the consumer facing sites like automotive, construction, and so on. And these industries now they really have a very high pressure to become sustainable with all the regulations, with the social pressure and so on. And then also the B2C industry, so fashion, beauty, food, and so on, where basically the success of the company to a large part depends on its image, on brand loyalty, and on what consumers do think about it.
And out with the industries, would you say that there's specific geographical identification? So there's more geographical regions that are more likely to partake in greenwashing than others?
Definitely, yes. Definitely, yes. So when you look at ESG and sustainability in general, you could say that it is still a first world problem, right? So it's very present in the West. It's getting more and more present, for instance, in China, in Japan, and so on. So in some Asian countries, we did some studies actually on how ESG is developing in the Asian area. And what comes out is that there is a lot of effort being spent, but there is still also a long way basically to catch up with what we see in Europe, in North America, and so on. And I mean, this is something that creates pressure on the companies. Greenwashing is generated by pressure, right? So I would say that definitely is much more present like in Europe and in North America, and now also getting more and more present in Asian countries. But on the other hand, it's also a question of how the society reacts to it and whether a society actually values it. And again, that's something that we rather see in the OECD countries than, let's say, in other regions.
Yeah, because to install that value in itself, it takes a lot of political engagement and a lot of political effort to ensure that there is the forefront for sustainability.
Yeah, it's a mindset shift that's required, right? So
very much so. How can an individual identify greenwashing, though? So you've given the example of the Save the Towels movement that was introduced in the 80s. But if we're looking at an extensive or sort of larger scale analysis, how can an individual really identify it? I mean, it's not as an individual, you can't go out and do like a corpus analysis on every paper that's published by unless you're yourself. So how can individuals really identify that a corporation is greenwashing?
It's really challenging. So what we believe is that, and that's something also that we implement in our approach that we now suggest for detecting greenwashing, is basically that to identify greenwashing. So it's a problem where you basically really need to combine a variety of data sources, because each data source kind of has a specific stakeholder group that it targets. And when you look at these data sources individually, then you always find that there is some kind of bias, whether it's positive or negative. So let me give you an example. For instance, greenwashing mainly originates in the communication of the company. So it can come from the marketing communication. It can also come from the official ESG reports, which can also, to some extent, be viewed as marketing materials. And then what you frequently see, of course, is that the company is over-reporting some positive data. It's kind of cutting back on the negative sides and so on. So there you can fully expect this positivity bias. Then you can go to the more critical side and, for instance, look at publications by environment NGOs. But these, on their own end, they will also have some kind of bias. They will normally be much more critical, much more skeptical, and they are prone to negativity. And then you can look at all the financial press, you can all look at all the consumer-facing press, maybe even the social media, and kind of put the puzzle together, right, of what all these different perspectives and these different data sources entail in kind of the big picture. So it's really a task that requires a lot of judgment. The problem that you often have is also information asymmetry. So companies often make very vague claims. I mean, you see these adjectives, the typical ones, green, eco-friendly, recycled, and so on everywhere. But then it's actually really hard to get down to the more specific data to back these claims. And for consumers, that can be very hard to evaluate. And even if you have the data, as a consumer, you don't necessarily have this domain knowledge to really judge them in an appropriate way.
But there's certainly enough data that you could access from like publicly available data that you could access and then interpret. Well, let's move on to the task that you've agreed to undertake with your colleagues from academia. Can you sort of flesh out the scenario for us? Why are you conducting this task, which we know a little bit by now? And what data is being used? What are the stages involved?
Yeah, so at the SwissTech conference this year, we are conducting a task on detecting greenwashing from big data, where we invite mainly students, but also data scientists and NLP researchers from industry to participate. And we suggest a rather specific approach to greenwashing in this task, which is basically to take a large body of text, so a data set that we provide that contains both the internal communication of the companies in the DAX index, so in the German DAX index, and the external communication about these companies, so third-party data. And the approach that we suggest is basically to analyze these two types of data and then to look at discrepancies between them. So discrepancies on the one hand, on the level of sentiment, and then on the other hand, also on the level of specific ESG topics, of the sustainable development goals, and so on. So our hypothesis is that if the gaps are too big, I mean, it's quite obvious for a sentiment, it might be a bit less obvious for the topics, then that might be an indicator of greenwashing. This is something that we are doing at TechWintel. It's not something that we now strictly need for our clients or, out of business considerations. But we really believe that this is a very exciting and future-oriented task. And we wanted really to have it as a shared task because I think it needs this kind of collective intelligence to get together, because each of us has some experience with greenwashing, has her or his specific views about it. And I think it's very valuable to bring all these different perspectives together. And it's a very empirical and very exploratory task, as said, because now, there are no fixed approaches or definitions in this domain. And that's why we believe it's very exciting to actually get a lot of different ideas, opinions, and approaches together and discuss them.
Very much so. One thing that interests me is you said that the discrepancies in sentiment might be easier to identify. Why is this, or what are you using to identify sentiment?
So we use sentiment analysis. So basically classifiers that are trained on annotated text data. So text data that is annotated either for positive or for negative sentiment. And then the sentiment classifier is basically able to learn the linguistic cues for a negative versus positive sentiment. So it can be specific words, it can be specific word combinations, and so on. What is a bit challenging in our task for a sentiment analysis is that we have very different data types. So one is the ESG reports. These are normally quite long and they are normally quite positive, and they are normally also quite formal in their language. And then on the other hand, all the business press, the general press about the companies, the texts are much shorter, and they're also often much more emotional and, negative and positive sentiments mixed and so on than the formal communication of the company. So this is why one of the subtasks is actually about also annotating a specific test data set in a stratified way, so that we then can also test and evaluate the sentiment equally on both types of data.
Fascinating. So do you think in general that AI can be used to identify greenwashing in corporate sustainability claims? And what are the key indicators that the technology can detect that maybe corporations can use?
So a couple of indicators. So the first one we discussed, right, is this discrepancy between the internal data and the external data. And I believe it's very important for the companies also to shape their ESG communication, because, oftentimes you really see that there is this kind of misalignment, and then it already does trigger some kind of mistrust, lack of credibility, and so on. And consumers and investors, both of them, they're actually quite skeptical when it comes to greenwashing, to sustainability claims, and so on. They just don't have this ability to always differentiate between them in a very precise manner. But still, if a company can achieve a communication that is aligned and does address somehow the issues and the concerns that are mentioned externally about this company, then it definitely also increases the credibility of its sustainability claims. And the second one, as said, it's all these adjectives, fluffy, vague, like eco-friendly, green, and so on, sustainable, which are then not backed by data, right? And that's, again, something that you can often also identify in the marketing materials. I have to say that this task is actually more challenging from the linguistic perspective, because it really requires you to see the whole report or the whole text in a much broader and pragmatic context. So you really need to be able to identify the claim, the high level claim itself, and then to go into the whole document and see, okay, is there actually some specific data to back up this claim? And this is a task that is hard to automate fully at the moment. So that's why we would say that there is always a human in the loop that should be involved to curate the data, curate the outcomes, and so on, and then provide a really reliable result in the end.
Do you think then, talking about investors being able to use it as a tool, do you see AI in that respect as a tool of empowerment for investors to be able to carry out due diligence?
Definitely, it's interesting for investors to prepare their investment decisions. It can also be interesting to consumers to prepare their purchase decisions, right? So I would say that's definitely an application or a use case for such a technology, because it can really save you all this manual labor that you normally have to put in to detect greenwashing manually, especially for investors who manage bigger portfolios, like also asset managers and so on. Of course, you don't have the time to be checking every company regularly on signs of greenwashing, right? So that's definitely an interesting target group then also.
Yeah. Consumers as well. So let's say hypothetically, I was a consumer and I was interested in a specific organization's sustainability claims or the extent of their greenwashing. How do you foresee individual consumers that are not watching the space getting this valuable information? Like, how do you see this valuable information being transmitted extensively?
There are actually some efforts that have been undertaken on this. So, for instance, one of them is called Greenwashing Files. You can find it online, and it's kind of an analysis of greenwashing activities, especially by the oil and gas companies. And it's kind of a centralized repository. Misfortunately, there are not so many companies in it so far, but it's a centralized repository of basically analysis of misleading sustainability claims. So I think that that's a good way to have a platform or have a central repository where all these activities can be exposed and analyzed in an objective way. But as said, the quantity can be the scale of it can be an issue. And that's why we really believe that a platform that also has this AI component in the background that can constantly collect new data and analyze this data without requiring too much human effort, that it could also help us, let's say, scale up the visibility and also the value of such a platform.
Mm-hmm. There's many people as well that sometimes become skeptical when we talk about little human effort. I mean, there's a lot of talk in the space and the AI space that it's important that humans are kept in the loop. And you just mentioned there sometimes with little human effort, like allowing the AI to collect the data, that we can achieve a lot. So my question would then go to, are there any limitations of using AI to detect greenwashing? And how can we overcome these as well and ensure that there are accurate and reliable results?
Mm-hmm. Thanks for the question. It's very relevant. So human in the loop is, of course, a big topic, right? And that's always a question of how much human in the loop. So I would say that to accurately detect greenwashing, we do need human in the loop at the current state of the art in AI. So we do need it, as said, to kind of provide this kind of human judgment. So after the AI has analyzed all the data sources, has kind of merged them into specific scores and specific analysis, I would say that we still need humans to look at the facts, to look at the data behind it, and then actually to verify it. That's one thing. And that's, I think it's quite clear because any NLP system, even, the most powerful LLMs that we have now, it always will make some kind of mistakes. And I think that this is a scenario where we really don't want to admit these mistakes. Yeah, because the space is already fluffy and vague enough. So there is no need for more vague stuff and proxy stuff, approximations, and so on. But on the other hand, what you can always do with AI when you have it in your user-facing system or a user-facing product is also to work with confidence scores. Right. So, for instance, if you see a specific constellation of data that is very indicative of greenwashing, then you would provide it a higher confidence score. And if you're much less confident about it, or maybe you didn't see this kind of constellation in your earlier data, then the confidence score would be lower. So that's also a very viable way to present the outputs of an AI system, but then you really need to make sure that the end user is able to understand the implications of this confidence score and to use them, kind of to work with them. Yeah, because that's something that we sometimes see when we don't educate our users about the potential for, let's say, for approximation and so on in the end results. Then they just take the data as it is and they just, continue working with it without considering this different confidence that it might actually have.
So what do you hope that your own efforts will bring?
Well, as said, we really hope that in this domain, we can bring together this collective intelligence. Yeah, so both on the technical side and then also on the social side, because greenwashing is really a socially very relevant phenomenon. And as said, for us, this is not really a for-profit task. It's much more about bringing this awareness into the society and maybe also inspiring people to get started working on a system that can actually kind of analyze greenwashing on a much larger scale, analyze it dynamically so that consumers, investors, and companies have this central, let's say, platform where they can go and they can see basically the data situation and all the signs of potential greenwashing that exist about them.
Admirable. I think it's great that you're taking the initiative and that you're exploring what is happening. You're providing access to information and knowledge and ensuring that there is this encouragement of the social movement. So thank you. And thank you for all of the wisdom and insight that you've shared with us today here on Redefining AI, Janna.
Thanks for having me. Thank you, Lauren.
So I'd like to thank everyone else for listening today. If you'd like to find out more about AI, NLP or search, then go to the Squirrel Academy on learn.squirrel.com. Thank you.